When you envision a psychic, what do you normally picture? For many people, that's probably somebody who can either read minds or see into the future. And maybe for some of you, that's somebody who can just move things with their mind. I mean, I don't know about you, personally, the ability for telekinesis sounds pretty great. I'd honestly love to move furniture around my house without breaking my back. But, as cool as that sounds, what if you couldn't control that ability? Now that might sound strange, but that's exactly what happened to a girl named Angelique Cottin, a 14-year-old French girl who was studied for months by the scientific community for her bizarre ability to seemingly move things with her mind. On this episode, we're going to take a look at the Electrical Girl and some of the stories surrounding her life. I'm your host, Alex Morell, and this is Odd Encounters. Our story begins in 1846 in the French village of Bouvigny. It was a stormy night on January 15th, around 8 p.m., that Angelique Cottin and three other girls were working to weave silk gloves in a nearby barn. Everything was going just fine at first, and I guess it was really nothing out of the ordinary for the girls. Until one of the wooden cylinders on a machine flew off with such great force that all of the girls actually blamed one another because they thought it was some sort of prank. So they throw it back on the machine and they try to get back to work, but then it happens again. But this time, it's followed by the weaving frame that Angelique's working on sliding away from her and shaking violently. Now, for whatever reason, the girls don't really think anything of this, and so they try to hold the machine still so that Angelique can keep working. But, as they do this, things start flying off of all of the nearby shelves, and so they flee the barn in a panic. They end up finding a group of nearby adults, and they tell them what happened, but the adults, being kind of leery of the story, basically, shoo the girls along and tell them to get back to work. So the girls do just that. But this time, they notice something different. Whenever Angelique gets close to any of the pieces of equipment or loose objects, they react to her presence specifically. So this time, they return to the adults, but they're adamant that what they saw was real. So eventually, news makes its way through the town and back to Angelique's parents, who immediately assume that she's either bewitched by some kind of black magic, or she's possessed. And I know what you're all thinking, it's the 1800s. You have to have ghosts in your blood. That's the only explanation. So they end up setting up an exorcism with a local priest. But when they meet with the priest, he never performs that exorcism. Why? Well, apparently he let his curiosity get the better of him because he wanted to see Angelique's abilities for himself. So he tests her abilities by placing small objects like a book or a pen in front of her, and every one of them reacts to her. And after testing this for a while, he eventually comes to the conclusion that it's her apron causing the issue. He says that he noticed the objects that touched the apron seemed to react a little bit more violently than the ones that didn't. So they hand her apron to this guy named Monsieur Herbert, and they have him sit in a wooden tub. But nothing really happens. I mean, at this point, we're basically four people watching a guy sit in a wooden tub and hold an apron. That is until Angelique jumps in the tub with him, and it starts to levitate off of the ground. It sits there for about 30 seconds, floating off of the ground and, kind of rocking back and forth a little bit, before it sets itself back down. Now, the only other thing that's mentioned about this meeting with the priest is that everybody who was in the room could feel this kind of electrical shock whenever she would get close to them. So, the priest, sitting there bewildered and not really sure what to think, recommends that they take her to a physician. Angelique's parents end up spending the rest of the day trying to find her an appointment, and eventually they do. They land with a physician named Dr. Tonshu, but it wouldn't be very long before Dr. Tonshu got to see these abilities for himself. Because as soon as Angelique walked into his office and sat down on the chair, it flew back from behind her, sending her tumbling to the ground. So after seeing this, Dr. Tonshu decides to set up some examinations and ends up putting her under observation for about a week. The first thing he pays attention to is the pattern. It seems like between 7 a.m. to 9 a.m., the ability is at its strongest, and every 3 days it basically vanishes, and then by the end of that day, it just shows back up. He also runs some other small tests similar to what the priest had done by placing small objects in front of her, and those all give him a reaction. He also tests this by suspending a needle from a thread, and then watching it follow the motion of Angelique's arm from a distance. Now, after witnessing this, several other people had also came forward to make a claim that in that time, they saw Angelique move a boulder the size of a horse-drawn carriage, which is basically a Honda Civic, push it with the simple touch of a finger. Now, I mean, this is pretty impressive considering that most grown adults can't even do that. So the physician is basically left at a loss for words at this point and ends up diagnosing her with nervous maladies, which basically just means that she has a problem with her nervous system. The only other thing that I would say is worth note is that he did make note of her being extremely apathetic in both body and mind, which in modern terms basically means that she probably had some form of depression. Now, I'll mention why that's relevant a little bit later in the episode, but at this point, Angelique's parents are basically at a loss for words and desperately searching for answers. This search ends up leading them to Paris, France, to a man named Francois Arago, a respected scientist and astronomer. Francois and two other scientists end up turning their observatory into a makeshift laboratory. Now, at the time, electricity wasn't really commonplace. I mean, most houses were still lit by candle and heated by wood-burning stove. So, their first assumption is that this has to be some sort of electrical problem. So the men start their testing the same way everyone else does, with small objects like a fire poker or a shoe or a piece of wood. And they get successful results from this. They then follow this testing by taking up the electric shock theory that everybody has come up with. And so they each stand on one side of the room and slowly approach Angelique, and as they all say, and I quote, they could feel a true electric shock. So they noted this, and then they moved on with their testing. They learned that the left side of her body seemed to be much hotter than the right side of her body during the events, and for whatever reason, her left hand would tremble uncontrollably, whereas her right hand would be very steady. So, at this point, they're starting to deduce that maybe it's coming from the left side of her body. So, they have her try to move objects with the left side facing, and they definitely react a lot more violent than the right side. Following this, they conclude that it actually came from her pelvic region, because whenever she moved things with her left side, they did react fairly violently, but whenever she would attempt to sit on something, that's whenever she would notice it slide across the room or float or do something crazy. So, in an attempt to debunk this, they put 3 of the men on a wooden chest that's full of rock, and they have Angelique get close to the chest and attempt to sit on it. But when she does, the chest and all 3 of the men go sliding across the room. Now, all 3 of the men are completely stunned and have no way to explain this, but they come to the conclusion that it can't be something electrical. However, it might be something magnetic. So, in an effort to attempt this, they take a magnet and put it in front of Angelique, but they don't tell her which side of the magnet is the North Pole and which side is the South Pole. And so, Angelique touches both ends of the magnet, and she claims to feel a shock from one of the sides. The side she feels the shock from ends up being the north side of the magnet. So, the men attempt to verify that she's not just faking this, and they secretly switched the polarity of the magnet and had her touch it again, but this time, she didn't identify the same side as being the problem. So, in their conclusion, she was able to correctly identify the field of magnetism that was coming from the magnet. After the men completed their investigations, they released all of their findings to Popular Science Monthly in an article that was titled "The Electrical Girl." This article swept the nation and ended up causing a huge debate in the scientific community, because at the time, there was a large spiritualist movement where people were heavily focused on the paranormal and supernatural. That ended up giving birth to a field of research called psychical research, which is what we now know today as parapsychology. So, at the time, a lot of stories like Angelique's were investigated and reported, but they were usually debunked as being nothing more than a poltergeist, a possession, or a misinterpretation. But on the other end of this argument, the skeptics point the finger at her not being a psychic, but actually being an illusionist. During that time period, there was a popular process called spirit rapping. Now, this is basically a process where you ask a ghost a question like, "Are you with us?" And then you listen for a series of taps or knocks in response. While that was seen as a viable research method, it was also a pretty useful stage gimmick. Now, they would often hide somebody in another room and then use fishing line to move objects around to give them the appearance that some sort of spirit or ghost was moving the object. That person would also knock on the wall or make strange noises to give the effect. This would happen while the person hosting the seance, which is the scammer, would use their leg to shake the table or tap underneath of the table to give the illusion that the ghost came into that room. This, alongside the rise of stage magicians, really made people raise their eyebrow to the validity of Angelique's story. Take Lulu Hurst, for example, an American stage magician who claimed that she gained her powers from a thunderstorm. One of her tricks was to sit 3 men on the end of a chair and then use one hand to tilt the chair down to give the illusion that she was capable of lifting several hundred pounds with just a few fingers. But later on in life, when she had an autobiography written about her, she admitted that the solution wasn't exactly magic, it was more knowing how forces and balance worked. While Lulu Hurst wasn't the only person to ever fake a talent to get on stage, a lot of people have pointed to similarities between her and other stage magicians' acts and the story of Angelique Cottin. With all of the debate around the topic of the electrical girl, the Academy of Science ended up launching their own investigation that lasted for 5 days. They rigorously tested Angelique, but they never turned anything up. The only thing that they ever found was that she could make a chair rock a little bit, and that was it. But a lot of people harshly criticized the methods that they used because they only tested this with the methods that Francois Arago used, leaving out any testing for true psychic power, magnetic phenomena, or some kind of ghost. So many people believed that the test results they got weren't good. At this point, however, some 10 weeks have gone by since the first experience that Angelique had, and she and her family have just now returned home. But within a week of her being home, her ability all but vanished. It's never returned, leaving her to live the rest of her life as the Electric Girl of Bouvigny. And to this day, no one has ever supported any good evidence to either support the story or debunk the story. Thanks to modern day technology, we've been able to study cases similar to Angelique's, and some people have pointed to what's been named the slider phenomenon. Now, SLI individuals are people who are seen to have an overactive nervous system, which makes them extremely sensitive to electrical inputs. So the symptoms they would usually deal with, for example, are whenever they're around street lights or any light, the light will typically malfunction or flicker, or it may get brighter. They also have a sensitivity to magnets, and they also have a problem with things flying away from them or being attracted to them. There's several other symptoms, but relating those few symptoms that I mentioned to Angelique's story, she definitely had a problem with objects flying away or flying towards her. She definitely had a sensitivity to magnetism, and she definitely seemed to have picked this ability up during an intense electrical storm. So, did she have an overactive nervous system like the physician diagnosed, or did she have a true magic ability? Or maybe the answer was a little bit more paranormal. Some people have pointed to poltergeists as a theory for why Angelique dealt with what she dealt with. Now, in parapsychology, a poltergeist is known as a very loud and noisy ghost. They typically throw things, slam things of that nature. Now, poltergeists by definition, can actually be created by a person's own suffering. And looking back at the notes that the doctor made about Angelique, it's likely that she was suffering from some sort of mental health condition. So, by the laws of how a poltergeist can be created, in theory, she may have accidentally created a poltergeist for herself, which, wreaked havoc on her life for 10 weeks before it finally went away. But at the end of the day, maybe the answer was something a little bit more simple: money. It's not too far-fetched to think that in a world where people saw around-the-world oddities and circuses and magic shows and psychics as good entertainment and sometimes scientific practice, a lot of them paid top dollar to see it. So it's not too far-fetched to think that a struggling Angelique and her family may have came up with their own routine to create this grandiose hoax and make a little bit of money to feed themselves. It's pretty common that happened at the time. We've seen all of the other stage magicians like Sammy Abbott and Lulu Hurst, and they did it pretty well. But at the end of all of that, I still can't help but wondering how there were so many witnesses to these incredible events, yet when she was put up against a board of scientists, none of them were able to verify the claim. Maybe she was under enough pressure that she couldn't perform. Maybe the abilities were finally at the ending peak of when they died off right before she went home. Maybe it was a ghost. But whatever it was, I want to know what you think it was down in the comments below. Maybe it was something I didn't even mention as a theory in this episode, but I'm certainly curious to see what you guys think. Was it a hoax? You guys let me know. But until then, the story of the Electric Girl will definitely remain one of the most interesting cases of a psychic that's went down in history to date. Until next time, thank you for tuning in to Odd Encounters. Hey guys, thanks for tuning in for another episode of Odd Encounters. If you haven't already, go check out my last episode on the Alaskan Triangle, and make sure to head over to my socials if you want important updates on the show. For example, if I do a paranormal investigation, you're definitely going to see stuff like that on my Instagram before you're going to see it here on YouTube and Spotify. I also have a section of the show that I'm working on where I want to share your stories, and so if you have stories that you'd like to share, whether it's anonymously or you want your username included, you can send those to oddencounterspodcast@gmail.com, and I'd be happy to share those on my Listener Encounters series. And if you enjoyed the video, please drop a subscribe and a like. It really helps small creators like myself. So once again, thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.